Once upon a time, in the small village of ÈvìЛ, there lived a man named Àgbò who had two daughters. His first daughter, Judith, was born from his first wife, who died shortly after giving birth to her. His second daughter, Helen, was born from his second wife, Èzènè, a woman known for her cunning and wickedness. Èzènè's envy had unconsciously seeped into her daughter, Helen, who grew up harboring a deep-seated hatred towards her sister, Judith. Judith was not only beautiful but also kind, and her beauty attracted numerous suitors. Despite this, Àgbò was reluctant to marry her off, as he had promised his friend Uche that his daughter would marry Uche's only son. Àgbò and Uche had agreed that their children would marry in the future, strengthening the bond between their families. At the time, Àgbò had only Judith and envisioned her his friend's son's wife. However, when he discussed this with Èzènè, she disagreed, arguing that Helen too was his daughter and should be considered for the match. Èzènè's true motive was to prevent Judith from marrying John and moving abroad, as John, who had spent most of his life abroad, was soon returning to marry his bride and take her back with him. Èzènè wanted her daughter Helen to marry John and relocate abroad. John, a tall and handsome man who had been abroad for many years, studying and building a life, agreed to fulfill his father's promise upon his return. His arrival in the village caused quite a stir, and both sisters were eager to meet him. When Àbùtù brought John to Àgbò's house, everyone was excited. John was to choose his bride from among Àgbò's two daughters and was advised to spend time with both of them to make his decision. Èzènè was determined to sway John's choice. Introduced her daughter Helen to him first, making sure Judith didn't meet him before her. She pushed Helen forward, hoping to build a connection between her daughter and John before he could even meet Judith. John and Helen began to spend a lot of time together, developing a connection. Helen could already see herself marrying John. He was refined, soft-spoken, and had an accent that suited her nerves. For days, John visited their home just to spend time with Helen, much to Èzènè's delight. However, Èzènè's joy was short-lived when John finally met Judith. The connection between John and Judith was instant. John shifted all his attention to Judith, and they spent hours talking and laughing together. This infuriated Helen, who became extremely jealous seeing the man she desired spending time with her half-sister. Helen accused Judith of stealing her man. One evening, filled with anger, Helen confronted her mother Èzènè, demanding action. Èzènè determined to teach Judith a lesson for trying to take John away from her daughter. She visited an evil woman in the forest and requested a charm to make Judith's stomach gradually grow big. Èzènè hoped to use this charm to accuse Judith of being pregnant out of wedlock. She knew that John would refuse to marry Judith if he realized she was pregnant by another man. The evil woman gave her a substance to spray in Judith's room, ensuring that only Judith would inhale it. Èzènè returned home, eager to see Judith suffer. One early morning, she snuck into Judith's room and sprayed the substance, making sure she did not inhale any herself. After successfully completing her deed, Èzènè left the room and waited patiently to see results of her evil plot. Days passed, but nothing seemed to happen. Troubled, Èzènè visited the evil woman again, who reassured her that the charm had worked but might take some time to show results. Èzènè returned home that evening, hoping the charm's effect would soon appear before John declared his interest in marrying Judith. As the days went by, John continued to visit their home, requesting to see Judith. One evening, Èvìll, Judith's sister, out of jealousy, lied to John, saying Judith was not around. Èvìll seized this opportunity to spend time with John, who seemed to enjoy her company. However, Èvìll couldn't shake the thought that John was merely being polite and feigning interest in their conversation. This angered her greatly. She resolved that John would not end up with Judith, and she decided that if she couldn't have him, neither would Judith. Èvìll decided to tarnish Judith's reputation in John's eyes. She paid a woman to approach John and inform him that Judith was a prostitute who had slept with her married brother. The woman claimed Judith secretly slept with men in the village for money. She told John to visit a certain place in the night where he would find Judith. John was shocked. That night he visited the spot the woman had mentioned, and to his surprise, he found Judith there. Disheartened, John returned home without saying a word. The next day, John visited their home, but instead of asking to see Judith as usual, he requested to see Èvìll. For days, John and Èvìll spent time together, and Èvìll was thrilled to see her daughter with John. The thought of her daughter moving abroad filled her with immense joy. Judith, on the other hand, was puzzled by John's sudden coldness. She tried to talk to him several times, but John seemed uninterested. Èvìll advised Judith to stop pursuing a man who clearly did not want her. She warned Judith to stay away from John or risk having Èvìll tell the entire village that Judith was trying to steal her man. Judith felt defeated. Returned to her room. The next morning, she woke up with severe stomach pain and complained to her father Àgbò, who took her to the village healer. Upon hearing this, Èvìll laughed, knowing her charm was at work. She couldn't wait to see Judith with a protruding stomach, which would make everyone believe she was pregnant. Èvìll was overjoyed as their plan to marry John was becoming successful. With only a few days left before John was to choose his bride, Èvìll eagerly anticipated the look on Judith's face when John would announce her as his bride. The thought filled her with immense joy as she waited in anticipation. The morning finally arrived, and Èvìll woke up excited. She got out of bed and began preparing as John had promised to visit that morning. After a few hours, her mother rushed in to inform her that John had arrived. She told Èvìll to stay in her room until she was called, and then left to join John and her husband in the living room. A few minutes later, a loud scream came from Èvìll's room, prompting them to rush in and see what had happened. To their shock, Èvìll discovered that her daughter's stomach had grown extremely large. Èvìll looked heavily pregnant, and Èvìll was confused because she had believed the charm was meant to affect her stepdaughter Judith. What Èvìll didn't realize was that on that day that she sprayed the charm in Judith's room, Èvìll had been there looking for something to use against Judith. When Èvìll heard the door open, she hid, thinking it was Judith. Unknown to her, it was her mother who had come in the room to spray the charm. Once her mother left, Èvìll had hurriedly walked out of the room, inhaling the charm meant for Judith. Meanwhile, Èvìll remained unaware that the charm was affecting her own daughter. Judith, who Èvìll thought was suffering from the charm, was only reacting to an allergy. Èvìll watched in dismay as Èvìll cried out in pain. Everyone, including John, stood by, watching as Èvìll cried. Her father, Àgbò, puzzled by the situation, decided to call a healer who turned out to be a gifted seer. The healer arrived and immediately understood the situation. She pointed a finger at Èvìll, accusing her of letting her envy and jealousy ruin her own daughter's life. The healer warned that if Èvìll did not confess, Èvìll would die. The healer then revealed that Èvìll could only be healed if her heart was pure. She said Helen needed to purge herself of all the evil within her by confessing, or the healing would not work and she would die from the pain. The room fell silent as Ezinne began to confess all the terrible things she had done to Judith. Ezinne admitted to plotting against Judith out of envy, describing how she had visited the evil woman in the forest and sprayed a charm in Judith's room, intending to make Judith look pregnant to prevent her from marrying John. Everyone was shocked, unable to believe that Ezinne was capable of such cruelty. The healer then turned to Helen, asking her if she had anything to confess. Helen revealed that she had set up Judith to ensure she wouldn't end up with John. She confessed to paying a woman to lie to John, saying Judith was a prostitute who had slept with her married brother. Helen had instructed the woman to tell John that Judith frequented a certain place at night. Knowing John would visit the spot to investigate, Helen then told Judith that John wanted to meet her at that exact location to ensure John saw her there that night. John was stunned as he listened to Helen's confession. His heart ached for Judith, who had been so wronged by her own family. He approached Judith, who had just returned from the healer's hut. Devastated by the confessions, standing in the corner broken, Judith looked up as John approached her to apologize for believing all the lies. He pleaded for her forgiveness, promising to never let her down. Judith, overwhelmed with emotion, forgave John, and he asked her to be his wife. Ezinne could hardly believe how everything had backfired. Watching as Judith agreed to marry John, she deeply regretted all the evil she had done. Both Ezinne and her daughter Helen asked Judith for forgiveness, and Judith, understanding that holding on to anger would only poison her own heart, forgave them. The healer then proceeded with Helen's treatment. She gave Helen a potion to drink to purge the evil from her heart. Helen took the potion and drank it down. Immediately, the swelling in her stomach began to subside, and the pain eased off gently. Thus, Judith married John and left the country with him as his wife. They built their life together and lived happily ever after. Helen, however, remained in the village single as no man came forward to propose to her due to the stigma she had brought upon herself. She spent her days regretting her actions, hoping that one day she might find a husband. Thank you for watching my story. The lesson to be learned here is that envy and malice can cause immense destruction in life. It is essential to foster love and understanding and to seek the truth before jumping to conclusions. True character is not built on perfection, but on the willingness to acknowledge one's mistake and strive to be better. Forgiving others is crucial, as holding on to grudges only poisons one's own heart. Goodbye.